me begin, first of all, by talking a little bit about what we know, which, as I said, is very tendentious, about the lives of women in the Arabian Peninsula prior to the coming of Islam. Of course, so this was a tribal system. There was not much by way of any kind of central government or police control or security. It was a group of tribes that lived often constantly in warfare, or constantly, maybe not serious warfare, but raiding one another. So it was not a particularly secure environment, to say the least. But what we know about this period in pre-Islamic Arabia, which is called, you may have heard this, but it's referred to in the Quran and then in Islamic tradition as the Jahiliya. Have you come across this word in any of your readings? Okay, so the Jahiliya period, the word Jahiliya means like a period of ignorance, but the word that it comes from, Jahil, doesn't just mean ignorance, it means a kind of boorish ignorance, like, you know, people who like to fight and, you know, are kind of very belligerent and slightly rude and crass, and on top of the fact also lacking in knowledge. So to say this is the Jahiliya period, of course, was Muslims looking back at this period critically, right, and seeing Islam as an improvement upon the situation at that time. So what we know about this Jahiliya period, or this pre-Islamic period in Arabia, as I said, is tendentious, because there are a few kind of writings on rocks. I shouldn't say a few. They've now found quite a few writings in sort of Proto-Arabic script on rocks. But again, not something that gives us a full picture of life in Arabia prior to Islam. And so much of what we know comes from Muslims writing later, right? And obviously writing, you know, with the intention of comparing the past to the situation in Arabia. Now, there are some things that seem to come out of the accounts we have of pre-Islamic Arabia that some people might say show a certain degree of freedom for women in the pre-Islamic period. So there doesn't seem to have been a set of stringent or certainly widely recognized moral restrictions on women at that time. Not in the tribe in Mecca that Muhammad comes from, but there are reports that other tribes throughout Arabia may have in fact had matrilineal relationships of inheritance, where the child belonged to the mother and was related and close to the mother, and then by extension to the mother's family. We also have suggestions that there was the practice of polyandry, right? We know about the practice of polygamy or polygyny, but there are some suggestions that, especially in a matrilineal situation where the lineage went through the mother, a woman might have several quote-unquote husbands. She would remain with her family, and the husbands might come and visit her and then leave, stay for a while and leave, and so on. And it wouldn't matter to know, let's say, who was the father for a particular child, because it was matrilineal. So there's some suggestion that some tribes follow these kinds of practices. Of course, they come under great criticism in the Islamic period. But because the situation was so insecure, it was also a very dangerous place for women to be, and one, as I said, that sometimes could be rather demeaning to them. So the Quran itself bears witness to the fact that having daughters was considered a real shame, almost a kind of disaster for families at this time, in part because women could not defend the tribe or the clan, and in fact were particularly vulnerable to violation in a raid which would be very dishonorable. So we have the Quran kind of alludes to, and also of course criticizes and rejects, a practice called female infanticide. That when young girls were born, the father would go out and kill them, burying them alive, right, because of the shame of having a daughter. The Quran also alludes to the fact that, again, and this is something we have seen in other tribal systems, even early ancient Israelite culture bears witness to this as well, that when a woman's husband died, she might be inherited by her husband's brother, whether she particularly liked her husband's brother or not, that she was something that would be inherited. Now, again, when we look at those two practices, female infanticide and the fact that women are inherited, or may have been in some tribes, we see that this actually kind of connects with the idea of matrilinear polyandry, right? Because if you had a fairly widespread practice of female infanticide, what would be the demographic result of that? You would have too many men. You wouldn't have enough women for men. So polyandry would have almost become a kind of necessity in a situation like that, and matrilineal would follow from polyandry. There was no way to test DNA and find out who belonged to who. And the fact that women, there may have been so few women, again, would have made the inheritance of women something that would have been, a favorable thing for tribes trying to keep women in their family. So we don't know, but some of these pieces of information we get do fit together into a kind of coherent picture of what things may have been like for women in pre-Islamic Arabia. Of course, when Islam comes, the Quran rejects, and very strongly rejects, both the idea of female infanticide and the idea of women being inherited. In fact, as we'll see, women become heirs. The Quran establishes women as legal heirs that cannot be disinherited from their parents and from their husbands and children. So women become inheritors rather than something to be inherited. Okay, so what about Muhammad's own life? So we know that this is not just a patriarchal system or a patriarchal culture into which Islam emerges. Of course, most of the world was patriarchal almost universally at that time. But this was a really heavily masculine culture where the masculine would have been celebrated. But Muhammad comes into this system with what would seem to be a profound disadvantage. He is the first child to be born of his parents' marriage, but his father dies before he's born, which means he doesn't have a father. Not having a father in a heavily patriarchal system is generally not a good thing, right? Your father is going to establish your place in society. He has no brothers because his father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was still quite young. He also doesn't have any sons that survive to adulthood. All of this doesn't bode well in a patriarchal society where everything depended on your father, your brothers, and your sons. So it is a kind of strange situation in which Muhammad lives in this particular culture. And for that reason, his wives and his daughters, of course, are very close to him. He depends on them a great deal. He was openly affectionate with his daughters, with his children, with his grandchildren. And the women in Muhammad's life are almost universally portrayed in the tradition as being very strong women. As being women who had their own point of view, who would at times challenge Muhammad on things, who were outspoken in their community.